I had always imagined this moment, the day my little girl would get married. I pictured myself standing proudly beside her, watching her take this step into a new life, knowing that I had done my part as her father. What I never imagined was how fast it would come. This morning, I had stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting my tie, smoothing my suit. It wasn't just about looking right, it was about feeling right. I wanted everything to be perfect today. No distractions. No worries. Just happiness. When Sarah walked into the room, I felt something tighten in my chest. She looked stunning in her wedding dress, glowing with the kind of joy that was rare and pure. "Dad?" she said softly, her voice filled with the same warmth I had known since she was a little girl. I couldn't find the words. I just smiled, nodded, and pulled her into a hug. The ceremony was as perfect as I had hoped. I sat beside Kathy, our hands occasionally brushing against each other, watching as our daughter exchanged vows. I glanced at my wife. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her expression full of love and pride. I had always admired how graceful she was, how composed. We had built something strong together, a life full of trust, commitment, and shared memories. Through every challenge, we had held on. That was what love was, wasn't it? At the reception, I made my way through the crowd, shaking hands, thanking guests for coming. Laughter filled the room. The sound of glasses clinking together in toasts. It was a celebration, and I felt like the luckiest man in the world. George was at the bar, lifting his glass in my direction. My best friend. He had been there for so many milestones in my life, from college to business to fatherhood. I walked over, and he clapped a hand on my shoulder, grinning. "To your daughter," he said. I clinked my glass against his. "To Sarah." It was a good night. Then I stepped outside. I only wanted a breath of air, a moment to myself before diving back into the celebration. But just as I reached the back of the restaurant, I heard voices, low, urgent. I wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have listened, if I hadn't recognized them. "Kathy." "George." I froze. "I can't believe we pulled this off for so long." Kathy's voice drifted through the night air. There was something in her tone, relief, maybe? Sadness. "All these years hiding," George replied. "It wasn't easy." Silence. A long, heavy pause. "We had no choice," Kathy whispered. "But after today, I don't know how much longer I can pretend." My stomach dropped. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The world I had spent my entire life building, the marriage, the family, the trust, collapsed in a single instant. I had spent years believing I was a man who had everything. But now, standing in the shadows of my daughter's wedding, I realized I had nothing at all. I stood frozen in the dark, the laughter and music from the reception muffled behind me. My body felt disconnected from my mind, like I was floating outside myself, watching a moment that didn't belong to me. Kathy and George. The two people I had trusted most in this world. I had to move. Had to leave before they saw me. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. I forced myself to step back, careful, slow, and then I turned and walked away, slipping through the side entrance of the restaurant. Inside, the warmth and noise of the celebration swallowed me whole. People were dancing, raising glasses, caught in the joy of the night. No one knew that just outside, my entire life had crumbled to dust. I spotted Kathy near the head table, talking to some guests, smiling like nothing had happened. My stomach twisted. How long? How many years had she smiled at me like that, knowing she was lying to my face? Someone clapped me on the back. James, my new son-in-law, grinning from ear to ear. "Henry, sir, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. This wedding. Sarah and I couldn't have asked for more." I nodded automatically. "Of course," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. I had to keep it together. I had to make it through this night. Sarah was at the center of the dance floor, laughing as she swayed in James' arms. This was her moment. I wouldn't take that away from her. So I smiled. I shook hands. I let myself get pulled into conversations. I played my part. But my mind was somewhere else, replaying the words I had heard over and over again. All these years hiding. It wasn't easy. I found myself near the bar, needing something, anything, to drown out the roar in my head. A drink, maybe? Something strong. But before I could order, George appeared at my side. "Hell of a night, huh?" he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see my best friend. I saw a stranger. A man who had stolen something from me, right under my nose for years. I swallowed back the words burning at the tip of my tongue. Not here. Not now. I forced a chuckle, nodding as if nothing had changed. "Yeah," I said. "Hell of a night." I barely tasted the whiskey as I knocked it back, letting the burn settle in my chest. It didn't help. Nothing could. George stood beside me, unaware, or maybe too confident to suspect anything. He leaned against the bar, watching the crowd with that easy smile of his. The same smile I had trusted for decades. The same one he had worn while betraying me. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. I had made my decision. I wouldn't ruin this night for Sarah. No matter how deep the knife in my back was buried, no matter how much I wanted to grab George by the collar and demand answers, I wouldn't let this wedding become about me. So I did what I had done my whole life. I played my part. I greeted guests, shook hands, laughed in the right places. I even danced with Kathy, my hand on the small of her back, guiding her across the floor like we were the perfect couple. She looked up at me with soft, knowing eyes, and for the first time, I wondered if she could see the shift in me. Did she know? Could she feel it? Or was she so used to lying that even now, even standing inches away from me, she believed I was still blind? The thought made my skin crawl. She leaned in, whispering, "Sarah looks so happy, doesn't she?" I swallowed down the bile rising in my throat. "She does." Kathy smiled, squeezing my hand like everything was fine. I wanted to pull away. Instead, I held on. Because this moment wasn't mine to destroy. Not yet. The night stretched on, laughter and music filling every corner of the room. I went through the motions, all while my mind churned with questions I wasn't ready to face. How long had it been going on? How had I not seen it? Had there ever been a moment in our marriage that was real, or had it all been built on deception? More than anything, I wanted to know why. And as I looked at Kathy across the room, standing beside George, her laughter blending with his in a way I had never noticed before, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted the answer. The drive home was quiet. Kathy sat beside me in the passenger seat, humming softly to herself, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. She seemed content, lost in the afterglow of the wedding. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Every glance in her direction made my stomach twist. How could she sit there so calmly? How could she look at me like nothing had changed? Or maybe, for her, nothing had. Maybe this was just another night. Another act in a play she had been performing for years. The thought made my fingers itch. I wanted to pull over, to demand the truth right there on the side of the road. To finally rip the mask off and force her to say the words out loud. But I didn't. Because I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I drove in silence, listening to the tires hum against the pavement, feeling the weight of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the house felt different. Colder. The walls that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, holding secrets I hadn't been meant to uncover. Kathy stretched, sighing as she stepped inside. "God, what a perfect night," she said, kicking off her heels. Sarah was glowing, wasn't she? I hung my jacket by the door, swallowing the bitter taste in my mouth. "Yeah," I said. "She was." She turned to me then, studying my face like she had only just realized I hadn't said much all evening. "Are you sure you're okay?" There it was again. That concern. That softness. Had it ever been real? I forced a smile. Just tired. She seemed to accept that, nodding before heading upstairs. Come to bed soon, she called over her shoulder. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before I moved. My legs felt heavy, like I was dragging something unseen behind me, something suffocating. I found myself in my office, the only place that still felt like mine. The walls were lined with books and framed photographs, memories of a life I had believed in. My wedding day. Sarah's first steps. Family vacations where we all looked so happy, so whole. Lies. I sank into my chair, pressing my hands to my face. What now? I had spent my entire life solving problems, making decisions, fixing things. But this wasn't something I could fix. This was something I had to face. And when I did, there would be no turning back. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Kathy's breathing beside me. For years, that sound had been comforting, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. Now it felt foreign. Wrong. I turned onto my side, watching her in the dim glow of the moonlight. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed in sleep. Did she dream of him? Did she ever wake up beside me and wish it was him instead? I clenched my jaw and forced myself to look away. Morning came, and I barely touched my coffee. Kathy moved around the kitchen with ease, humming to herself as she made breakfast. The same routine we had followed for years. Sarah called this morning, she said, flipping through a magazine at the table. She and James got to the resort safely. She sounded so happy. I nodded absently, stirring my coffee though I had no intention of drinking it. My mind was elsewhere. How about you? She asked suddenly, glancing up at me. You seem quiet. I swallowed, forcing my expression to remain neutral. Just thinking. About what? For a brief moment, I almost said it. I almost threw it all on the table right then and there. But the words stuck in my throat. Not yet. Instead, I pushed back my chair, standing. I have work to do. Her brow furrowed, just slightly. On a Sunday? I forced a smile. Just a few things to take care of. She didn't press further, and I walked out of the kitchen, my hands shaking at my sides. I needed answers. And I wasn't going to find them sitting in the same house as the woman who had been lying to me for years. I drove with no real direction at first, just letting the road stretch out before me. My thoughts were a tangled mess, looping back to the same questions over and over again. How long? Why? Had I ever really known my wife at all? Without fully realizing it, I found myself parked outside his house. George's place. The man I had called my best friend. I stared at the front door, my pulse pounding in my ears. A part of me wanted to march up and confront him, to force the truth from his mouth. Another part wanted to turn around and leave, to bury this deep inside and pretend I had never heard what I heard. But I wasn't the same man I had been yesterday. I wasn't blind anymore. So I stepped out of the car. And I knocked on the door. The knock echoed in the quiet morning air. I stood there, hands clenched at my sides, heart hammering against my ribs. Part of me hoped he wasn't home, that I could leave and put this off a little longer. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't change anything. After a few seconds, the door opened. George stood there, dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, holding a coffee mug. His face broke into a smile when he saw me. Henry! Didn't expect to see you today. I studied him. The man I had trusted for decades. The man I had invited into my home, into my life. The man who had sat beside me at my daughter's wedding, laughing and toasting as if nothing had ever happened. I could barely look at him. Mind if I come in? My voice was calm, too calm. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Of course. He stepped aside, motioning me in. The house was familiar, yet now it felt foreign. I had been here countless times for barbecues, late-night conversations, poker games. Now, every piece of furniture, every framed photo on the wall, felt tainted. George set his mug down on the kitchen counter. What's going on? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his eyes. I know. The air between us shifted. A flicker of something crossed his face, something quick, unreadable, but he recovered fast. No, what? I exhaled sharply. Don't do that. Don't play dumb. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. I heard you. Last night. Behind the restaurant. Silence. For the first time in all the years I had known him, George looked nervous. His fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. His jaw flexed. Then, slowly, he sighed. Henry! I shook my head. Don't say my name like that. He ran a hand over his face, then finally met my gaze. I never wanted you to find out this way. I let out a cold laugh. And how exactly did you want me to find out, George? Were you planning on telling me at all? His mouth opened, then closed again. He had no answer. I took a step closer. How long? He hesitated. How long? My voice was sharper now, demanding. A heavy pause. Then, quietly, too quietly, he said, A long time. The words hit harder than I expected, like a fist to the gut. I had been bracing for it, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I nodded slowly, looking away for a moment, trying to process it. Was it ever going to stop? George didn't answer. That was an answer in itself. My hands curled into fists. I had always pictured betrayal as something dramatic, heated fights, shouting matches, breaking things. But this was worse. This quiet confirmation, this unspoken admission of guilt, was like a slow knife twisting in my ribs. I took a shaky breath and turned toward the door. I don't know what's worse, I said without looking back. That you did it, or that you were willing to keep doing it. And with that I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I drove without thinking, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was a storm, thoughts crashing into each other, questions I didn't want to ask clawing at the edges of my sanity. A long time. That's what he had said? Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A long time. I pulled into my driveway but didn't get out right away. I just sat there, staring at the house that I had built, the life that had felt so solid just a day ago. Kathy was inside. The woman I had loved. The woman I had trusted. The woman who had been lying to me for God knows how long. I exhaled, slow and controlled. Then I stepped out of the car. The house was quiet when I walked in. I found Kathy in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, a cup of tea resting on the side table. She looked up when she heard me, smiling. There you are, she said. You were gone for a while. I watched her for a second, my pulse hammering in my ears. She looked so normal. So casual. Like any other Sunday morning. I forced myself to speak. Went for a drive. She nodded, stretching slightly. I was thinking we could go out for dinner tonight. Celebrate a little. The wedding was beautiful, wasn't it? The words sounded so hollow now. How many times had she spoken to me like this, with that same ease, knowing she was hiding something? I swallowed, my throat dry. Yeah. It was. Kathy studied me for a second. Are you okay? You seem off. That was twice now. 2 times she had asked me what was wrong. Did she really not know? Or was she testing me? Trying to gauge if I had found out? I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. Just a lot on my mind. Her expression softened. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. I know. It's a big moment for us. Our little girl is married now. Her touch burned against my skin. I stared at her hand over mine, something dark and bitter rising in my chest. Did she hold his hand like this too? Did she squeeze his fingers with the same soft affection she was giving me right now? I pulled away, standing. I need to get some work done. She blinked, slightly surprised but not suspicious. All right. I'll let you know about dinner. I nodded and walked away, heading upstairs to my office. The moment I shut the door behind me, I exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of my desk. I had spoken to George. I had confirmation. But that wasn't enough. I needed the whole truth. I sat down, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through old messages. And then I opened Kathy's laptop. I had never been the kind of husband who snooped. Never had a reason to. But now I wasn't sure who I had been living with for the past 25 years. If she had been hiding this from me, what else had she been hiding? I clicked through emails, browser history, anything I could find. I needed something concrete. Something that told me just how deep this betrayal ran. And then, my fingers froze over the trackpad. There it was. An email. A single line from Kathy to George. I hate sneaking around, but I can't lose him. Not yet. My vision blurred. Not yet. Not yet. What did that mean? That she had planned to leave me? That she had been waiting for the right moment? That she was only still here because she wasn't ready to rip my world apart? A wave of nausea rolled through me. This wasn't just some long-term affair. This was something deeper. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. I stared at the words on the screen, my breath coming in slow, uneven pulls. I hate sneaking around, but I can't lose him. Not yet. Not yet. That was the part that burned. That single word, yet, was a ticking clock I hadn't known existed. It meant she had been waiting, planning. It meant she had an exit strategy. I had spent the last 25 years believing in a life that she had already decided was temporary. My hands curled into fists. I scrolled further, scanning for more messages, more proof. But most of the emails were short. Careful. Kathy wasn't careless, she never had been. She was too smart for that. But this one email, this one crack in her armor, was enough. I closed the laptop and sat back, my mind racing. What now? What did a man do when he realized the woman he built his life around had been planning to leave him? When his best friend, the man he would have trusted with his life, had been standing beside him all these years, knowing the truth? I could feel something inside me shifting. The anger wasn't sharp yet, wasn't wild. It was cold, slow-moving. Measured. This wasn't something I could ignore. But it also wasn't something I could rush. I needed to know more. I went through the rest of the day in a haze. Kathy was her usual self, cooking dinner, talking about Sarah and James, acting like everything was normal. I played along. I responded at the right moments, nodded when I was supposed to, let her brush against me like a wife who had nothing to hide. But inside I was watching. Calculating. Noticing things I had never noticed before. The way she checked her phone more than usual. The way she hesitated before speaking, like she was choosing her words carefully. The way she watched me, like she was waiting for something. Did she suspect? That night, I lay awake again, listening to the steady sound of her breathing beside me. I could confront her. I could demand answers. But if she had been lying for this long, what were the chances she would tell me the truth? No. I needed something solid. I needed proof. I needed to catch her in a way she couldn't deny. And as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. I wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. I was a man hunting for the truth. And once I found it, there would be no going back. The next morning, I woke before Kathy. I didn't move right away, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. She had no idea. No idea that the man lying next to her was no longer the fool she had been deceiving for years. No idea that every word she spoke, every glance she gave, every touch she offered, was now being measured and examined. Carefully, I slipped out of bed and made my way downstairs. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but I didn't drink it. My mind was too wired for that. I had spent my entire life as a man of action. I built a business from nothing, provided for my family, handled every problem that came my way. I didn't wait for things to happen, I made them happen. And now, I was going to do the same with this. I needed more than just a single email. I needed proof. Something undeniable. Something I could throw in her face and watch the mask slip away. And I had a plan. Kathy came downstairs an hour later, still in her robe, looking soft and effortless, like a woman with nothing to hide. "Morning," she said, brushing a kiss against my cheek. I forced myself not to pull away. "Morning." She moved around the kitchen, pouring her own coffee, checking her phone briefly before slipping it into her robe pocket. "Busy day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She smiled. "Not too bad. A few errands. Lunch with Emily." I nodded. A lie. I had already checked her messages. There was nothing about meeting Emily. That meant she was going somewhere she didn't want me to know about. Good. That was exactly what I needed. By the time she left the house a few hours later, I was ready. I gave her a normal goodbye, even smiled, watching as she backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. Then I grabbed my keys and followed. I wasn't proud of it. But pride didn't matter anymore. Not after everything she had done. I kept my distance, staying a few cars back, watching as she made her way across town. Not to Emily's place. Not even close. Instead, she pulled into a small parking lot behind a quiet cafe. And 5 minutes later, George pulled in beside her. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. There it was. Not whispers in the dark. Not an email. Physical proof. I watched as they got out of their cars, as they exchanged a look, as George's hand barely, lightly, touched her back as they walked inside. That was all I needed to see. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat steady. The anger was there, but it wasn't wild. It wasn't uncontrollable. It was focused. I had what I needed. And now, it was time to decide exactly what I was going to do with it. I didn't follow them inside. I could have. I could have walked straight into that cafe, stood in front of them, watched their faces twist in shock as I threw their betrayal in their laps. But that would have been easy. That would have given them the chance to lie, to scramble, to twist the story into something less than what it was. No, I wanted more than that. I wanted to watch. I parked a little farther down the street, just within sight of the cafe's windows. From this distance, I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. Their body language told me everything. Kathy sat across from George, leaning in slightly, her expression serious. George was speaking, his hands moving as he talked. Every so often, she'd glance around the cafe, like she was afraid of being seen. Good. She should be afraid. I watched as George reached across the table and took her hand. It wasn't a dramatic, passionate movement, no, it was something smaller. More practiced. Something they had done 1,000 times before. That was what made my stomach turn. This wasn't some affair built on reckless passion. It wasn't some drunken mistake that had spiraled out of control. It was deep. It was built on years of something I had never been aware of, something that had existed alongside my marriage like a shadow I had never seen. My jaw clenched. After about an hour they left. I followed them as they walked to their cars. They spoke for another minute then. She hugged him. It wasn't long. It wasn't lingering. But it was enough. Enough to tell me what I needed to know. Then they parted ways. Kathy got in her car and drove home. I stayed parked, watching George's taillights fade into the distance. Now I knew. Now I had proof. By the time I got home, Kathy was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. The scent of garlic and onions filled the air, the kind of smell that once would have made this place feel warm, comforting. Now it made my stomach turn. "Hey!" She greeted me with a smile, looking up briefly. "How was your day?" I studied her. This woman, my wife, stood in my kitchen, cooking our dinner, asking me about my day, just hours after sitting across from another man, sharing quiet words and stolen touches. And she didn't even look guilty. How many times had she done this before? How many nights had she come home to me after seeing him, setting the table, kissing my cheek, pretending like everything was normal? Something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not violently. It was quiet. Cold. I stepped forward, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. You have a good lunch? She barely hesitated. Yeah. Emily and I had a great time. I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I smiled. Because now, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I stood in the kitchen, watching Kathy move around like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't just spent the afternoon with George. Like she wasn't lying to my face. I could have confronted her right then and there. I could have thrown everything on the table. The overheard conversation, the email, what I had just seen at the cafe. I could have demanded an explanation. But I didn't want an explanation. I wanted the truth. Not her version of it, not whatever half-lies and justifications she would scramble to put together once she realized I knew. The real truth. And for that, I needed her to believe she was still in control. So I did what I had always done. I played my role. Dinner was quiet, normal. Kathy talked about Sarah, about how happy she was. I nodded in the right places, gave short answers when needed, all while my mind was already 5 steps ahead. If I confronted her now, she would lie. Of course she would. She had been lying for years. But if I let her walk into the trap herself, if I let her expose the truth with her own hands, that would be something she couldn't twist. Later that night, when Kathy was asleep, I sat in my office, staring at my laptop screen. I had to be careful. If she had been hiding this from me for so long, she wouldn't be careless. She had already kept most of her emails vague, no long confessions, no obvious details. But phones? Phones were different. People got sloppy with their texts, especially when they felt safe. I reached for her phone, which she had left charging on the nightstand. A rare mistake. I hesitated for just a moment. Then I took a deep breath and unlocked it. No password. My chest tightened. Either she never expected me to check, or she thought she had nothing to hide. I went straight to her messages. Emily's name was near the top. I tapped on it. A real conversation. They had made vague plans for coffee later in the week, but no mention of today. I scrolled further. Then I found George. At first glance, it was innocent enough. Their last message exchange was about the wedding, public conversation. Safe. But then I saw it. A hidden chat. She had muted the notifications. The messages weren't in her regular inbox. I opened it, my pulse pounding. And there it was. A thread of messages going back for years. The most recent one sent just hours ago. It felt so good to see you today. I needed that. I always need you. My blood ran cold. I kept scrolling. Years. Messages about stolen moments. About missing each other. About times they had spent together. About me. I wish I could tell him the truth, but it's not the right time. He doesn't deserve this. Not yet. That phrase again. Not yet. I exhaled slowly, my hands shaking. There was no denying it now. No excuse she could give that would make this go away. I had her. And now, it was time to make her face it. For the first time in my marriage, I felt like I was the one in control. Kathy had spent years weaving her lies, hiding in plain sight, thinking she was always one step ahead. But now, I was the one holding the cards. And she had no idea. I sat down at the kitchen table, watching her move around the stove. She was completely at ease, humming to herself, stirring the pot like she wasn't carrying a secret heavy enough to shatter everything. I should have felt anger boiling inside me, but I didn't. Not anymore. The rage had cooled into something sharper. Purpose. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to throw accusations at her. Not yet. I was going to let her hang herself with her own lies. Dinner was quiet, almost peaceful. Kathy talked about her day, about some new recipe she wanted to try, about how we should plan a trip soon now that Sarah was married. I listened. I nodded. I played my part. And then I dropped my first move. I ran into Emily today, I said casually, cutting a piece of my steak. Across from me, Kathy's fork paused midair for just a second. A flicker of hesitation. Barely noticeable, but I noticed. Oh, she said, recovering quickly. Where? The grocery store. I lied effortlessly. She said she hadn't seen you in a while. A second of silence. Then Kathy let out a small, breathy laugh. That's weird. I was just with her. I smiled. Huh. Maybe she forgot. Another pause. She glanced down at her plate, cutting her food into smaller bites, avoiding my eyes. Yeah. Maybe. I watched her carefully. She knew something was off. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out if she had slipped up. She was second-guessing herself now. Good. I wasn't just confronting her. I was making her feel what I felt. The paranoia. The doubt. The sinking feeling that something wasn't right. By the end of dinner, she was quieter. More distracted. She excused herself early, saying she had some emails to catch up on. I let her go. I had done enough for one night. I sat at the table alone, sipping my drink, letting the silence settle around me. I wasn't rushing this. Because the best way to catch a liar is to let them lie. The shift had begun. I could see it in Kathy's eyes the next morning, the way she watched me, the way she hesitated before speaking. She wasn't sure anymore. Something felt off to her. And that was exactly what I wanted. She had spent years believing she had complete control over this lie. Now, for the first time, she was questioning whether she still did. I let it build. I didn't accuse her. I didn't confront her. I just planted doubt. That afternoon, I made my next move. I texted George. Need to talk. Meet me at the bar. Short. Direct. No explanation. It didn't take long for him to reply. Everything okay? I stared at those words, my fingers tightening around my phone. The nerve of him, pretending to care, acting as if he hadn't spent years betraying me. I didn't respond. I just waited. And sure enough, an hour later, he walked into the bar. George looked cautious as he sat down across from me. He had that same easygoing smile, but there was tension behind it. You sounded serious, he said, motioning to the bartender for a drink. What's going on? I took my time. Sipped my whiskey. Let the silence stretch. Then, finally, I looked him dead in the eyes. Does Kathy ever talk about leaving me? His face barely changed, but I saw it. The flicker of panic, the slight twitch in his jaw. He recovered quickly, but it was too late. I had already seen the crack in his mask. What? He said, laughing slightly. Why would you ask that? I leaned forward, my voice calm. Too calm. Because I think she is. George shifted in his seat. He tried to play it cool, but he was rattled. Henry, come on. Kathy loves you. I gave him a long, hard stare. You sure about that? He swallowed. Of course. You two have been together forever. I nodded slowly. Yeah. We have. I let that sink in. George looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. Is she acting different or something? I almost laughed. He was fishing. Trying to figure out what I knew. I shrugged. Just a feeling. I downed the rest of my drink and stood. I guess we'll find out soon enough. George didn't say anything. He just sat there, gripping his glass, his easy confidence unraveling. I walked away without another word. Let him sweat. Because I wasn't done yet. By the time I got home, the storm was already brewing. Kathy was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes lifted the moment I walked in, scanning me like she was trying to read me instead. I set my keys down, taking my time, waiting. Then, just as I expected. How was your day? She asked. It was a simple question. An innocent one. But her tone gave her away. She was fishing. She knew something was off. I shrugged. Uneventful. A pause. She tilted her head, studying me. You sure? I smiled, small, knowing. Why? Should something have happened? She hesitated for just a second. Then she forced a soft laugh, shaking her head. No, of course not. Liar. She turned her attention back to her book, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't sure anymore. I was under her skin now. Good. That night she barely touched her dinner. I could feel the weight of her gaze, like she was waiting for me to say something, anything. But I didn't. I let the silence work for me. When she finally spoke, her voice was casual. Too casual. I was thinking maybe we should take a trip, she said. Just the two of us. Somewhere quiet. I nearly laughed. A trip? Now? She was scrambling. Trying to regain control. Trying to pull me back in before I could slip away. I wiped my mouth with my napkin and leaned back. Yeah, I said, meeting her eyes. Maybe we should. Her relief was visible, but it wouldn't last. Because I wasn't taking any more trips with this woman. I was watching her fall apart. And tomorrow, I would push her over the edge. Morning came, and with it, the final act. I had played my part well. I had let her think she was still in control, let her believe that if she smoothed things over, I would fall right back into place. But today, I was ending the game. I waited until Kathy was settled into her usual morning routine, coffee, reading, pretending everything was fine. Then I made my move. I walked into the kitchen, set my phone on the table, and slid it across to her. She blinked, looking up at me in confusion. What's this? I didn't answer. I just watched as she picked it up, glancing at the screen. Her face strained of color. It was a picture. Taken yesterday. Her and George at the cafe. His hand brushing her back, her leaning in too close. Proof. For a moment, she didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she set the phone down. Henry! She started. I held up a hand, stopping her. No more lies. I sat across from her, my voice calm. Too calm. How long? Her lips parted, her eyes desperate, searching for a way out. Henry, How long, Kathy? I repeated, my patience gone. She exhaled shakily. Then, in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it. A long time. I nodded, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from her mouth. Were you ever going to tell me? Silence. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. That was my answer. No. She had planned to keep this secret buried forever. Or worse, she had been waiting for the right moment to leave. And I would have never seen it coming. A bitter laugh escaped me. You had it all planned out, didn't you? Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. She didn't get to cry. Not after everything. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I shook my head, my jaw tightening. But you did. For years. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Then I stood. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, my coat. Kathy's eyes widened. Where are you going? I met her gaze one last time, my voice steady. Final. Away from you. And with that I walked out. For good.